who ended up being pilots who, despite male disapproval and the flimsy machines they were in, the constant danger that they faced, they would go up in the air and they would make history. And so today I want to introduce you to them. But to get started, we'll go right back to the beginnings of flight in this country. And of course, the first powered flights by humans were by those Wright brothers in a heavier and air flying machine. They did 4 flights on a windy beach in North Carolina, and the longest flight was 59 seconds. But that flight proved that an object that was heavier than air could go up and fly. What a lot of people don't realize is that 5 months before the Wright brothers demonstration, there was a young lady from New Jersey named Aida de Acosta who'd gone over to finishing school in Paris and seen a man demonstrating a aero machine there. And it was a powered dirigible, so a balloon, a shaped balloon. But he was going around town, going through, cruising around, picking up a champagne, picking up jewelry, picking up wherever he did, his dry cleaning, I don't know. But she thought this looked pretty wonderful. And when he came down, she asked him a number of questions. And finally, the question, could I try it? And remarkably, because we don't have any record that he said this to anybody else, he said yes to her, proceeded to give her 3 lessons in the airplane hangar where he had the dirigible stored, and then set her off. Now it only sat 1, so he literally set her off. He rode below on his bicycle and apparently used his handkerchief to tell her where to turn left and right. And they traveled all the way through Paris and out to Apollo grounds where teams from England and France were busy competing, and landed nearby and apparently caused quite a commotion. She remarked, "I stopped the petrol motor and came down like a feather. I never had so much fun in my life." And he told her, "Mademoiselle, vous êtes la première aérochauffeuse du monde. Miss, you're the first aero driver in the world." Now, this event was almost lost to history because her father was very displeased that she had done this. And when Alberto Santos Dumont was going to tell the papers about it, her father insisted that he not. He was one of these old school men who said that a woman should only appear in the newspapers when she was born, married, or died. But it did appear 50 years later, on the golden anniversary of the Wright brothers' flight. The AP, the national press, picked it up and talked about the first woman pilot. She also mentioned it. She was a friend of her father told her she could never go up flying again, but she ended up dallying with pilots, and her husband was a friend of Lindbergh, and she told a story at a table once that she had done this. In any event, by 1905, there were fixed wing aircrafts, and Alberto Santos Dumont flew the first one in Europe. And there's a competition or a kind of controversy about whether he or the Wright brothers were the first to actually have heavier than air powered flight, because the Wright brothers kept theirs secret for a number of years. In any event, finally, the Wright brothers brought their own machine to Europe, and along with their machine, they brought their sister to France, because they were 2 bicycle mechanics and they needed somebody to sort of hobnob with their customers, who were rich people and royalty and so forth. And their airplane was a 2-seater, so women got to fly, and they took up their sister Catherine. Here you see them showing the aircraft off to King Edward VII, and she loved it. She said, "Them was fine," when she wrote her father. But I do like to point out, do you see that rope tied around her neck? ankles. This is the year that the hobble skirt became popular in Europe and the Americas. And one origin story for that skirt is that it was because of these airplane rides that went up. The other one is that this is the year that Japan opened to the West. So there are two possibilities. But in any event, the French were entranced with Catherine and awarded all three rights the Legion of Honor. And then when they returned to the United States, President Taft gave all three of them medals. And Wilbur, in remembering the financial and moral support she'd given them, said, if ever the world thinks of us in connection with aviation, it must remember our sister. But the world's not done a very good job, although there is a book about her. Well, Catherine was a passenger, but soon women wanted to take the controls. And the first woman to do this was Elise Raymonde de Laroche. She was the daughter of a plumber who'd made a name for herself as an actress, but flying was transcending social barriers because everybody was getting entranced by it. So she loves adventure. She gets involved in all of these things, and she asks her airplane designer, her friend and probably lover, Charles Fosson, to teach her to fly. And he agrees. Now, airplanes at this time, they're very unsafe, they're fragile, they're unreliable, they're challenging, and they're lubricated with castor oil. So if you've ever wondered why many airplane flyers used scarves, one of the reasons was to protect their digestive system. In any event, this plane only seated one person, so he directed her from the ground, and she lifted off and flew 300 yards. And then the next day, she flew about 4 miles, circling the airfield. And on March 8th, 1910, she received the first pilot's license ever issued to a woman in France and turned professional, earning money at exhibitions and races all over Europe, as far away as Egypt and Russia. She witnessed many accidents, but she herself did not have any. She was indeed in Russia and St. Petersburg when many of the male flyers competing refused to fly because they were concerned about unstable air currents near these chimneys, but she went up anyway. And apparently the Tsar was quite impressed because he congratulated her afterwards and called her Baroness de Laroche, something she loved and sometimes something that stuck. She was questioned about engine failure or structural collapse and remarked, "Most of us spread the perils of a lifetime over a number of years. Others may pack them into a matter of only a few hours. In any case, whatever is to happen will happen. It may well be that I shall tempt fate once too often. Who knows, but it is to the air that I've dedicated myself, and I fly always without the slightest fear." She probably should have had a little bit more caution, because in July of 1910, she was in a bad crash and it would end up taking her 2 years to recover, but she would go back into the air. And on November 25th, 1913, she won the Femina Cup, a long distance race that had been established to encourage women flying over 4 hours. And then when airplane flying was grounded for women for recreational purposes during World War I, she became a military driver. And after the war, she went back to flying and set altitude and distance records. And look how far airplanes had come in just a few years. And she planned to be the first women's female professional test pilot. But she died, unfortunately, on July 18th, 1919, while she was in an experimental aircraft piloted by another flyer. Well, she was soon joined by other female pilots in Europe, including two that I will share with you, two that I just adore, Hélène Dutrieu and Marie Marvingt. Both of whom were incredible athletes, and they got lots and lots of different names, but my nicknames for each of them is Hélène Daring Do and Marie Marvelous, and you'll soon see why. So Hélène was called the Girl Hawk of aviation. She was born in 1877 in Belgium, and her family had some financial reverses, and so she was forced to leave school at age 14 to earn a living. But instead of doing the embroidery or lace making that would have been accustomed customary profession for a girl, she decided to follow her brother into professional cycling and became the women's speed track world champion in 1897, kept that in 1898, and got the nickname the Human Arrow for her speed and stamina. And if you've ever seen this famous poster by Toulouse-Lautrec, you can, she is the girl with the curls. Well, she moves on to theater, doing spectacular feats on her bicycle, including a loop-de-loop. And then she goes on to motorcycle and automobile racing. And her famous flying flume was described this way. Mounted on a bicycle, the girl slides down a steep chute, some 70 feet long like a flash, and then up a short incline. Then there's a gap of 40 feet wide in the track. So terrific is their momentum, however, that bicycle and girl take one blood-curdling leap over this 40-foot of space, alight on the track on the other side, and then dash into a rope stretched across the path. When Mademoiselle does this feat, there's only one unconcerned person, and that is herself. She said to go flying through the air is a delightful sensation. She was the Evel Knievel of her day. Fearless, however, it did eventually catch up with her, and she had a crash in 1908, landing her in the hospital for 6 months during the time when the Wright brothers were doing their European tour. As soon as she comes out, she sees these flying expositions for the Wright brothers, and her auto racing sponsors agree to sponsor her in an airplane. In fact, in an airplane that has been created by De Santos, the same person who'd been piloting in France around Paris. And it was called the demoiselle, which means either young lady or dragonfly, but it had a weight limit. So it was perfect to have a woman pilot it. But she found that the plane did not fly well and ended up canceling her very lucrative contract, and instead took lessons in a different kind of airplane, a Farman. And in April of 1909, she makes her first solo flight. She's up in the air for 20 minutes. She said that it was easier to keep flying than to figure out how to land, but that for the day was a woman's record. In November of 1910, she gets her license. She's the 4th woman in the world to do so. And along the way, she's setting altitude and duration and distance records for women, and also carries a passenger across country. And on December 22nd, 1910, she wins the new Kufamina Award with a 60-kilometer flight, a little over an hour. Well, as you can see, though, flying is so new that new records are basically being set every day. And she gets a new nickname, the Lady Hawk. She looks very young, but she's 31 at the time. And she, too, goes on the professional circuit, flying in air shows in Belgium, France, England, Italy, Russia, and comes to the United States, setting world records and exciting crowds. And in 1911, she beats 14 male pilots to win the King's Cup in Florence, Italy, and she wins the Kufamina that year as well. And the New York Times noted that of all the women flying, she's the only one who's kept pace with the leading aviators, and in many races even surpassed them. She is also in a plane crash, this time in October of 1911. She's uninjured, however, the papers are shocked to announce that she was not wearing a corset. She ends up being the first woman aviator to win the Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. And in 1914, she too is grounded, and she goes to the United States to fly fundraising flights for the Red Cross, and then she returns and becomes an ambulance driver and director of a military hospital. And she said, "Flying is my greatest pleasure. I believe it will be as common among women as it is becoming among men. In fact, I feel certain that women as well as men will use flying machines to travel from town to town." And also remarked, "The man who wants me must catch me in the air." We don't know for sure if that happened. We do know that after the war, she felt she would need a lot of time and money to build up the professional creds that the male aviators who'd flown for the military had gotten. And so she instead turned to becoming a journalist. She ended up marrying her publisher, and she worked in his business and public health the rest of her life. And in 1955, she established a long-distance flight prize to promote interest in flying in women, and died in 1961, so lived to a ripe old age. We come next to Wonder Woman, Marie Marvingt. I like to call her Marvelous Marie Marvingt. You'll see why in a moment. She was born in 1875. She was the daughter of a postmaster. Her mother and her only living brother were quite frail. So her father ended up encouraging his daughter in athletics instead. He was quite an athlete himself. And at age 5, she could swim over 2 miles. At age 15, she canoed about 250 miles from Nancy to Copeland's and dared to do anything. She drove a locomotive when she was a teenager. When the circus came to town, she learned how to do acrobatics on a galloping horse. She did trapeze, tightrope juggling. And in 1899, she'd become one of the first women in the world to get an automobile driver's license. She also became a sports champion, winning prizes in bicycling, swimming, fencing, shooting, ski jumper. She was a speed skater, a bobsledder. She also boxed. She was a golfer, tennis player, gymnast, and countless other sports. In 1906, she swam 2.5 miles on the Seine through Paris, beating the time of the Australian champion Annette Kellerman by over an hour, and was hailed as France's best woman swimmer. And in 1907, she won an international shooting contest against an all-male field. But probably one of her favorite things to do was bicycling. She bicycled all the way from her hometown of Nantes to Naples, Italy, over 1,300 kilometers. And in 1908, at the age of 32, she completed the 2,800-mile Tour de France. And if you were around, she was she was the first woman to do it. There were only 6 of the 114 men who tried it actually completed. And if you were around, I'd ask you, when were women actually formally admitted to the Tour de France? And then I'd say it is a trick question because they still aren't. She also was very dominant in winter sports, winning 20 first-place medals in skiing, ski jumping, bobsled, luge, and skating. And in 1910, the French Academy of Sports gave her a medal for all sports. It's the only one they've ever given. She also loved mountain climbing and would climb in a divided skirt like culottes, and often being the very first woman ever to climb some of the French and Swiss Alps. And she also opened the first civilian ski school in the world. But mountains weren't high enough for her. In 1901, she took her first balloon ride and learned how to pilot balloons in 1907, soloed as a certified balloon pilot in September of 1909, and in late October, she took a passenger. It was supposed to be a trip, just a short trip, but the wind blew them out to sea across the North Sea to England, and they were out for hours. The snow, there was a freak snowstorm, and the balloon basket bounced on the waves. It was quite harrowing. But when they landed in a tree in England, she went to fetch help for her passenger and was toasted by the press in England. And then she discovered airplanes right around the same time this is happening. September of 1909, she takes her first airplane flight, and November 8th, 1910, she becomes the third woman in the world to be licensed to fly fixed-wing aircraft, and the only one to earn it in the difficult-to-fly Antoinette monoplane. Everybody else had been flying these biplanes with the 2 parallel wings. And here you see her on the cover of La Vie à Grande Air, being toasted as being the new winner of the Femina Cup because she set a record in long distance flight. However, she would be defeated later that month by Helene. And the same thing would happen in 1911. She reportedly had over 900 flights in her life, and she never had a serious accident. The word in the early days was broke wood because these were wood-based airplanes. But she did have engine trouble in August of 1911 and had to bring her airplane down. And while she and the airplane were unhurt, souvenir hunters ripped off pieces of the fabric wing, so that damaged the airplane. Around this time, however, Marie conceived the idea of air ambulances, maybe because she saw so many accidents or just maybe because it occurred to her. And she went on a lecture tour all around Europe to raise money to build a prototype. But the company that she hired to build the prototype embezzled the money and didn't build the aircraft. And then the Great War broke out. And interestingly enough, the French military was not interested in this idea. So she left flying for a bit and ended up doing a number of other things. She was a trained nurse, so she volunteered in the surgery, the medical units in the war. She also apparently at one point disguised herself as a man and enlisted and remained there for several weeks or months before she was discovered. And she also is probably the first woman in the world to fly in combat, because after the war, she's given a Croix de Guerre for her participating in 2 air raids against the enemy airfield. We don't know how she did it, but one possibility is that she was friends with Field Marshal Foch, so she may have had friends in high places. She also participated in ski rescues, and she was a war correspondent, and there is suspicion she was a spy as well during the war, but she never admitted to that. For the next 40 years, she gave over 3,000 lectures advancing the idea of flying ambulance services all around the world. Initially, she suggested that these be operated by women pilots. Apparently, she spoke at least 5 languages and was quite well known. And in 1955, she was given an award for her work in aeromedical evacuation, and said, if we've given wings to the world, we have the obligation to ensure they are the wings of the dove of peace. She does establish a civil air ambulance service in Morocco in 1934. In 1935, she is the first certified flight nurse and works in Morocco and North Africa. She's dubbed the Flying Florence Nightingale. And in World War II, General Eisenhower named air evacuation along with penicillin and blood transfusion among the 3 most important medical innovations of the war. In her spare time, she also studied law, medicine, acting, singing, dancing, drawing, painting, sculpture. She played the cornet. She authored 2 books and made 2 films on air rescue, and she wrote articles and poems. She claimed that the reason that she could do this was she only needed 4 hours of sleep a night. She also invented metal skis for desert airplanes so they could land on sand. She competed in an auto race across the Sahara, and she founded a home for wounded airmen during World War II and invented a surgical suture device. She received the first license issued as an air rescuer and a total of 34 medals and decorations, more than any other woman in the history of France. And the American press called her the most extraordinary woman since Joan of Arc. On her 80th birthday, she was flown over her hometown in an American fighter jet, and she studied piloting helicopters. And at age 86, she rode her bike 175 miles from Nancy to Paris. Once asked why she did so many unusual things and tackled so many risks and challenges, she replied, because it is there. And I will leave you with her section by showing you her piloting the helicopter. It's in French, so don't worry if you're not hearing it.
Une Française, Mademoiselle Marvingt, a décidé de prendre sa première leçon d'hélicoptère. Certes, il n'est jamais trop tard pour bien faire, mais on est en droit de se demander ce que Mademoiselle Marvingt pourra faire de cet instrument lorsqu'elle saura parfaitement en jouer.
I love the dog. And her leaping and bounding at age 86, thrilled at this opportunity. Quite an amazing woman. And she lived to age 88, and when she died, sadly, she died impoverished. She didn't have any children. She had no relatives, and her possessions were dispersed. And it's only in recent years she's really gotten the credit she deserved. The question of who's the first woman pilot in the United States is a little bit more confused. Blanche Stewart Scott is the person I credit with there. Okay. Well, that was interesting. The dog interlude. So as I said, it was the first woman pilot of the U.S. in the U.S. It's a little bit confused, but I like to credit Blanche Stewart Scott. She was a car driver, one of the first women to drive the first woman to drive a long cross-country road trip, 3,000 miles. And when she gets to California, the press agent for Curtiss Aviation, who's a competitor of the Wrights, suggests she take flying lessons. And when she returns east and goes to New York to meet Curtiss, he's furious because he's sure that she'll crash his plane and bring a lot of bad publicity. So, but she says, no, I have this contract. You've got to honor it. So he ends up wedging wood in the throttle, and she's going around practicing, but she can't get enough lift, can't get enough power from the throttle to do that. And it's called grass cutting or kangaroo hops. And so anyway, but then one day, well, she's taking these, cutting the grass, as it were, on the side. And Curtiss is lunching with Alberto Santos Dumont. They hear that the engine gets faster, and suddenly she's flying in the air. And she says, well, something must have happened to that throttle block. Now, this is this woman who'd driven 3,000 miles in a car. She knew her way around the engine. It's probably not accidental that the wood block fell out. But she does fly that day. And as a result of this possibly being an accident, the American Society of Aviation credits Bessie Raish, who with her husband built an airplane, and she flies 2 weeks later. Incidentally, there's one other funny little piece about Blanche. She was riding back and forth to the airfield on a motorcycle that was quite large for her. And so she had a hard time dismounting. And one day, instead of dismounting, she sort of flew over the front of it. And Alberto Santos Dumont remarked, the little lady doesn't need to have an airplane to fly. She flies by herself. In any event, neither of those women got a pilot's license. In 1911, America began issuing licenses, but Glenn Curtiss told Blanche that they weren't worth the paper they were written on, so she didn't apply. Do you know who has number one? You're right, Glenn Curtiss. So the first licensed American woman pilot is Harriet Quimby. And she's quite a person. She was a journalist, and she wrote, the men flyers have given out the impression that aeroplaning is very perilous work, something that an ordinary mortal should not dream of attempting. But when I saw how easily the man flyers manipulated their machines, I said I could fly. She's born around the same time as these others in 1875. She's a Michigan farm girl. The farm fails. The family moves out west to California and works sewing bags for the farmers and other things for a number of years. And then she ends up becoming a journalist, an actress, and then a journalist, first in San Francisco and then in New York City at Leslie's Illustrated Weekly. She invents a new backstory for herself, saying that she was 9 years younger and has wealthy parents in California, but she's very successful. She writes drama critiques, household hits, political articles, silent movie screenplays. She learns photography and becomes a photojournalist all around the world, writes at least 250 articles for Leslie's under her own name, and people think she may have written others as well. But particularly is seeking out excitement anywhere she can. She covers an auto meet at the Vanderbilt racetrack and convinces one of the drivers to take her for a ride 100 miles per hour, holding onto a hat. And then she buys her own car, which she drives and repairs herself. And she gets Leslie's Illustrated Weekly to allow her to cover the International Aviation Tournament at Belmont Park in 1910, the first major international aviation event held in the States. And there she meets Mathilde Maussant, the sister of several of the flyers there. And she would later write, I saw one of the aviators make an exhibition flight, and I thought to myself, really, it looks quite easy. I believe I could do it myself. And after a minute, I resolved, and I will. So she asks one of Harriet's brothers, John Maussant, for lessons, but he is killed in flying before she can before he can teach her. So the following May, he takes lessons from Albert instead, and gets her publisher to pay the fee for them. And she goes dressed in jacket and trousers at dawn out to Long Island to disguise the fact she's a woman. She and Harriet take lessons together. And then her cover is literally blown away when her face mask covering is blown. Whether this was an accident or deliberate, since there were journalists on the scene, I leave to you to decide, but it is special to the New York Times reveals a woman in trousers daring aviator. She achieves her pilot certification August 1st, 1911. She's the 37th pilot to be certified in the States. And to give you a sense of how primitive flying was at the time, you had to fly up to 164 feet in the air to complete 5 figure eights and land within 100 feet of your takeoff location. And you had no brakes, so you had to roll to a stop. Well, she ends up setting a world's record, landing just 7 feet 4 inches away from her takeoff mark, whether that was an accident or not. And Mathilde also gets her license 2 weeks later. And she's sharing all these adventures with her readers, with articles including how a woman learns to fly and the dangers of flying and how to avoid them. And it was dangerous. Approximately 1 flyer a day was dying. She wrote, "Everyone asks me how it feels to fly. It feels like riding in a high-powered automobile minus bumping over the rough roads, continually signaling to clear the way, and keeping a watchful eye on the speedometer to see that you do not exceed the speed limit and provoke the wrath of the bicycle policeman or the covetous constable." And she said, "I do feel well qualified to tell a beginner how she must dress. If a woman wants to fly, first of all, she must, of course, abandon skirts and don a knickerbocker uniform." As she did, she designed her trademark flying outfit out of purple satin and wool, and she could put a skirt on when she was outside the airplane. And she was tall, elegant, and caught the public's imagination, and got a contract to promote Vin Fizz, the sparkling grape drink. On September 4th, 1911, the people on Staten Island, 20,000 people on Staten Island watched as Harriet Quimby became the first woman to fly at night. And she and Mathilde Moussant joined the Moussant International Aviators and went on tour all the way down to Mexico City. And Mathilde Moussant would break the women's altitude record at 12,000 feet. But Harriet knew any record she was going to break was immediately going to be broken by somebody else. She wanted to do something that would put her into the history books permanently. And so she decided she wanted to be the first woman to fly across the English Channel. So in March of 1912, she sails to England and she convinces Louis Blériot, who's recently flown across the channel in an airplane he designed, to lend her an airplane for the attempt. Most people don't think she'll manage it, but her friend and instructor, Gustav Hamel, in fact, initially offers to dress in her outfit and fly in her place and pretend he's her, which she, of course, says no to, but she does say yes when he offers to teach her to use a compass, which becomes essential. So in any event, her plane arrives from France on Saturday, April 13th, 1912, too late in the day to fly it. And she's promised her very religious mother that she will not fly on the Lord's Day. She had planned to practice flying this new airplane on Monday, but Monday turned out to be a very bad weather day. And so she was not able to do that. And you can see right here, she was annoyed from the start that people doubted her ability to do it. And she was more than determined to succeed. So on early Tuesday morning, she gets up and goes to fly this airplane she's never flown with a compass she's just learned how to use. And here is a video of that flight. And as I said, there were no brakes, so they were holding back that airplane until the propeller got enough momentum. So she wrote out her adventure in her own words to publish. And so you can hear it was 5:30 a.m. when she gets up, very cold when she gets in there. They were putting on a hot water bottle to keep her warm. But she takes off, and soon the motor is drowning out the shouts and cheers of friends below. She's up 1,500 feet, and she circles Dover Castle. She had promised the journalists on the ground that visual. And then she heads out to sea and right into pea soup fog. She can't see anything. She tries to go lower in order to get below the fog, and she does get some light there, but she really doesn't know where she is. So it's a good thing she has her compass, because she uses it to guide her across the channel and rather than out to sea where she might be lost forever. And she finally does see the shore and finds a good place to alight. It's an empty shore for a moment, and then the fisher folk, as she calls them, who've heard her land, rush to greet her. And they end up congratulating themselves that the first woman to cross in an airplane had landed on their fishing beach. And then when her car is brought, she gets into her automobile and she motors to Calais, time to catch a fast train and arrive in Paris at 7 p.m., a very tired but very happy woman. Everything went according to plan, except for one thing that was completely out of control. And that was what else happened that day. On April 17th, 1912, the New York Times and other papers revealed that the Titanic, which had hit an iceberg and sunk before midnight, April 14th, had sunk early in the morning, April 15th. When she crossed, it had seemed like everything was going to be fine. But after that, all the newspapers were reporting about the Titanic, and she was only on page 15 of the New York Times. That day was also almost fatal for her friend, because a gas leak in her fuel tank caused her aircraft to burst into flames, and it was only her wool costume that saved her, and she stopped flying. But Harriet Quimby, Miss Quimby, stayed very active on the flying front. She was giving interviews. Scientific American ran a story about her flight, and Good Housekeeping would feature her in their September 1912 issue. But tragically, it would appear posthumously, because on July 1st, 1912, she came to Boston to fly in the third aviation meet. And the day before the meet, she took the meet organizer in the back seat of her new double-seater Bolero, and they circled the lighthouse, and then something happened and the plane flipped over. Both of them fell out of the plane, and 11 months to the day after earning her pilot certificate, she was dead. We don't know to this day what happened. Apparently, William was a heavy man. He may have shifted his weight, or maybe the steering cables got tangled. All we know was she was lost. But her spirit lives on. Shortly after she earned her license, she said, "I do not want to be the first American woman to fly just for the publicity. I want to be the first. I've written so much about other people. I enjoy sitting back and reading about myself for once. I think that's excusable in me." And she also mentioned that aviation could be a very fruitful occupation for women, carrying passengers between adjacent towns, parcel delivery, taking aerial photographs, or conducting schools of flying. Any of these things it is now possible for women to do. While many of Harriet's predictions would come true with the ambitions of other flamboyant flyers, and I would love to tell you about all of them, but we don't have time, so I'm going to just limit myself to Bessie Coleman, also known as Queen Bess. She comes on the scene after World War I, after the Great War. She had two strikes against her. She was a woman and she was African American. And here you can learn a little bit about her.
June 15th, 1921. On that day, history was made. Bessie Coleman became the first African-American woman ever to get her pilot's license. flying uniform, Bessie was as glamorous as a movie star, and people treated her like one too. But even her fans didn't know her real story. Bessie Coleman's story began long ago in the little Texas town of Waxahachie. Bessie's family made their living picking cotton, but Bessie wanted to see the world. When she was old enough, she moved to the big city, Chicago. There, she heard amazing stories about the heroes who flew airplanes during the First World War. Bessie was inspired. She made up her mind then and there she had to fly. But the year was 1920. No African-American woman had ever become a pilot, and no one wanted to teach her. That didn't stop Bessie. If she couldn't get flying lessons in America, she'd just try somewhere else. So she saved her money and sailed across the ocean to France. There, Bessie got the lessons she wanted. When she returned, Bessie Coleman was a star. The first Black woman ever to have a pilot's license. There's Bessie, wearing her designer uniform and a big smile. Just imagine the crowds that showed up to watch this incredible woman perform in her tiny plane. They nicknamed her Queen Bess, and Bessie always gave her audience a terrific show. But for Bessie, that wasn't enough. She dreamed of starting her own school where everyone could learn to fly. Wherever she went, Bessie Coleman brought excitement and joy.
So Bessie Coleman was born in 1892, as they said, in a small Texas town, grew up as tenant farmers, and then went to Chicago, got a job as a manicurist, and then met businessmen, gangsters, jazz musicians, and her brothers fought in World War I and brought back stories of the airplanes, and she decided she wanted to be a pilot, but as the film said, no U.S. school would accept African Americans. So the publisher of the Chicago Defender, a Black newspaper, told her that France might, and he offered to help sponsor her, and she also saved up money from opening up a chili parlor. She learned French, and in November 1920, she sailed to France for a 10-month course, which she completed in 7. And on June 15, 1921, she got her license. She was the first African-American in the world, male or female, to do so. And she was the only woman among 62 candidates that session. She returns to the States, to New York City, great fame, gets a lot of press, but attention will not pay the bills. Nor to achieve her goal to open an aviation school for African Americans. So she spends the next 3 years doing barnstorming, shows around the country. She also appears in some silent movies. She does lectures. She does parachute jumping and wing walking. And she also opens a beauty shop in Florida with the goal of, as I said, of earning some money for that aviation school. Unfortunately, her first plane crashes and she has to fly in borrowed planes while she earns money to replace that airplane. In 1925, she's flying in Texas, and she refuses to fly in the show if the audience is restricted to segregated entrances. So they mix up the entrances, but then they segregate the audience anyway. She buys a Jenny. These were war surplus planes. And it's delivered in late April of 1926, and she's getting it ready for her first performance. And the night before, she flies as a passenger in her airplane because she's looking for good places for parachute jumps. And something happens while her mechanic is flying the plane. The engine seizes and it goes into a nosedive and flips, and she falls to her death. And also the mechanic dies. They know the cause was a loose wrench that jammed into the instruments, but they don't know how that wrench got there, whether it was an accident or sabotage. But her funeral attracted thousands of people, and her dream of a flying school for African Americans was realized after her death by William Powell in LA. The Tuskegee pilots were trained there. And William Powell would write, "There's a better job and a better future in aviation for Negroes than any other industry. And the reason is this: aviation is just beginning its period of growth. And if we get into it now, we can grow as aviation grows." And in 1990, Chicago named a road at O'Hare Airport Bessie Coleman Drive. And in 1995, the U.S. Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp for this American legend. And finally, we return to where we begin. Me, myself, and I. As I said, I was born in Long Island. I was called Long Island's youthful air queen, intrepid birdwoman, and flying flapper of Freeport. I grew up in Freeport. My father was a vaudeville performer, and I was encouraged by both my parents to seek out challenges. And as I mentioned, when I was 6 years old, we saw that those airplane rides being offered, and we became his best customers that summer. And he predicted one day I would fly with the great ones. At age 10, I started lessons. My legs were too short to reach the pedals, so they put blocks on so I could. At age 15, I wanted to fly solo, but my father said I was too young. So I waited until he was out on a vaudeville tour, and then I did so, practiced takeoffs and landings. And then after 10 days, the instructor climbed out. I took off. I climbed to 1,000 feet, leveled off. And as I would later write, I knew I was home and I would never turn back. And 3 months later, I would set a light plane altitude record of nearly 12,000 feet, which is too high up to be without oxygen. And I had no business doing that. In September 1927, I became the youngest licensed pilot in the world at age 16, after appealing to Orville Wright, who was still living, who was the chair of the National Aeronautic Association. The press wrote that I was not a real pilot, and a local male barnstormer who'd crashed his own plane, he made a bet that kid with freckles couldn't fly under a New York City bridge. And I said I would fly under all four. This was foolish. The gust of winds could throw my little plane hurl it into some of the columns. And it was also most likely illegal. But I did plan carefully. I inspected the route. I studied the tides. I looked at how the bridges were constructed. And I joked that I hung by my heels from all those bridges. I calculated speed, distance, weight, everything I needed. And I practiced weaving between sailboats. And on Sunday, October 21st, 1928, I got ready to take off in my father's WAC 09 plane. And I felt a tap on my shoulder, and Charles Lindbergh was there smiling. And he said, "Good luck, kid. Keep your nose down in the turns." And I was wearing my lucky sneakers, as I called them, and a red leather jacket. I figured that would be more visible if I did end up in the deep. Flying north, I realized that the Brooklyn and the Manhattan bridges were very close together. And I decided to go all the way north first and then take it going down. And then I saw that there were newsreel reporters on my way, but at this point, the die was cast. Despite my planning, I had several surprises, including wooden blocks that were dangling from the Queensboro Bridge, which I ended up having to dodge around, and a huge crowd of spectators on the Manhattan Bridge. And then when I got to the final bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, there was a tanker and a Navy destroyer that I had to tip my airplane and fly between. Here you go, you can see it. So after I finished that, I circled the Statue of Liberty twice, and then I flew back to Roosevelt Field on Long Island and to a cheering crowd. So I had succeeded, but in the back of my mind was that pesky little question, what about my license after doing this? And this was made even more worrisome 8 days later when I received a summons to go to the New York City mayor's office. And he began, "You're suspended," but went on, "from flying for 10 days, retroactive to the day of your flight." I believe that means 2 more days of not flying. And the Department of Commerce sent a letter to stop flying under the bridges, but they included a personal note asking for my autograph. So I'd done something no one else had done, and no one has done since. That was the introduction to an amazing year in 1929. I was able to convince aircraft designer Giuseppe Belanca to build me a custom 225 horsepower, 46-foot wingspan plane. And in April, I landed the 6-passenger aircraft at Curtiss Field, and the press corps was stunned that this 17-year-old climbed out of the cockpit. And I was then hired by Belanca Airplanes as a demonstration pilot, and later I'd be hired as a high altitude test pilot. That same April, I set a women's solo endurance record, flying Roosevelt Field for 26 hours, which was dead boring. The next month, though, was much more fun. I set a woman's world speed record of over 190 miles per hour. And in June, I was hired by the Irving Chute Company to fly the Belanca on a 6,000-mile tour of the United States, doing 7-man parachute drops. That November, I teamed up with my friend and fellow pilot Bobby Trout to set a women's endurance record, and together we flew 42 hours and did aerial refueling. The following March, I added almost a mile to the women's world altitude record, going up to just over 27,000 feet. And in May of 1930, at the ripe old age of 18, I became the youngest pilot, male or female, ever to receive the transport license from the Department of Commerce. So I became the first female executive pilot. Along with Amelia Earhart, I was feted in Washington, D.C. And the most gratifying thing of all was that October, I was named Woman Pilot of the Year by my fellow pilots. And that was against other pilots like Amelia. But it was really such an honor to consider, to know that my peers considered me the best. Incidentally, Jimmy Doolittle, the inventor of instrument flying, won the male award that year. I had planned or wanted to be the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, but of course I was not, because my sponsor pulled out. The Depression had wrecked their business. I was, however, the first woman test pilot for both Belanca and Fairchild aircraft companies. I was the first woman ever featured on a Wheaties box, the third person ever. And I had my own close call. In 1931, I was trying to fly above 30,000 feet when my oxygen tube was dislodged and I lost consciousness. But fortunately, at about 2,000 feet, I revived and was able to pull the airplane back up. From 1930 to 35, I hosted a weekly radio program. I wrote columns in magazines. I became an official advisor to the New York State Aviation Committee. And during that time, I also met and married a New York state legislator, Patrick Sullivan. And we soon had children, and I ended up having to leave flying because of that. But in 1956, when my husband died, I went back. My children were pretty well grown, and I started piloting jet trainers and doing paratrooper missions with the Air Force. And in March of 2000, at the age of 89, I was incredibly gratified when I was invited to fly NASA's Challenger vertical motion simulator at the Ames Research Center in California. I was the oldest pilot ever to be invited to do so. And I said, it's a spectacular ride. Everything about it is thrilling. But perhaps the most gratifying is that the entire support crew was made up of females. My instructor, the operator, and the assistant were all women. And women continue to take to the skies. March 6 through 12, 2010, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Baroness de Laroche's pilot license, women pilots from 8 countries on 3 continents used 20 types of aircraft to establish a new world record of 225 girls and women introduced to piloting by a woman pilot in 1 week. And that has become a Women in Aviation Worldwide Week each year. I myself, however, died a week later on March 19th, 2010. I was 98 years old. This is a little film that was made to celebrate the publication of a children's picture book called Soar Elinor that just reviews a little bit of my life. And that is me at age 97 or so. Reeve Lindbergh, the youngest daughter, the youngest child of Charles Lindbergh, wrote a book about Bessie Coleman called Nobody Owns the Sky, and this is the poem she composed. There was a young woman who wanted to fly, but the people said, kiss that wish goodbye. The sky's too big and the sky's too high, and you never will fly, so you'd better not try. But this woman laughed, and she just said, why? Nobody owns the sky. So I invite you, if you're interested in learning more about women pilots, as I said, there is a picture book about me. There's I wrote my autobiography, Aviatrix, and the author of the picture book, Tammy Lewis Brown, decided to challenge herself to write a blog entry for every day for an entire year about unsung women in aviation. And you can find links to all of those at nobodyownsthesky.wordpress.com, or you can go to my website, tellingherstories.com, and there's a link to this, so that's easier. And it has a bibliography of wonderful books about women in aviation. As you can see, lots more suggestions. You can also attend additional programs. I, Carol Simon Levin, do, as my husband calls me, Sybil, who will you be today? I do another one on flying about the women Air Force service pilots of World War II. I also have one on Emily Roebling, bridge builder in petticoats, and one on Juliet Gordon Low, Crazy Daisy, the intrepid founder of the Girl Scouts. I also have now 4 programs on women in American political history, and a book called Remembering the Ladies about amazing American women in politics. 69 women of all colors and creeds are portrayed by 36 different artists, and they're coloring pages and descriptive pages. And even you can use it as a travel guide when you start to travel again, because it tells you where there are museums. And I've got programs about Pickets and Persistence, How We Won the 19th Amendment Nationally, and Reclaiming Our Voice, New Jersey's Role. And I have a new program called Overlooked No More about the role of women of color in American political history. So I want to thank you so much. And if there's any questions, I can open the floor to them now.
Thank you so much, Carol. Anyone have questions? Probably have to unmute.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself and open your cameras and communicate. Amelia Earhart is, of course, the name that I could not find at the beginning of the program to save my soul. But yeah, basically, when people ask, why have we lost all these other people's names? I usually respond that it's because Amelia Earhart got lost. And when I was doing the research for this, if you Amazon, if that's the verb, the way you Google somebody, if you Amazoned Amelia Earhart, you got about 2,500 books. Whereas, most of the rest of the women I'm talking about only appeared in collective biographies. So really the mystery of her disappearance swallowed up an awful lot of journalistic and bibliographic ink. Any other question? I mean, I was stunned, for instance, I'd never heard about Marie Marvingt. She's such a character. They all are. They're all wonderful characters. So.
And one comment in the chat, terrific presentation. We all agree. Yes, terrific presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Anybody else comments or questions? Feel free to unmute yourself.
I just couldn't believe how many different things some of these women managed to do in a lifetime. Like even within just a few years, those lists were incredible.
Yeah, Marie's in particular is just mind-boggling. Yeah, even if first of all, I wouldn't function on 4 hours a night, and even if I only needed 4 hours a night, I would need a lot more nights to do all the things she did. She must have been just incredible. Now, she was somewhat of a self-promoter, but she's interviewed in newspapers, and she's doing this stuff. She never marries, so she doesn't have the domestic responsibilities, but she also just seems to be the original Energizer Bunny.
And also just so impressive that the feat of being the only person to fly underneath all 4 bridges. I'm surprised in learning about New York City history that never came up. That's
well, I think basically the aviation authorities, she was the first to try it, and how the first one to do it maybe gets away with a warning, but the aviation people said, anybody else who tries this, you will lose your license for life. Because it really is, it's exceedingly dangerous, not just for the pilot, but for the people who are on the bridges and the people who are in the river. It's not a smart thing to do.
So maybe that's why it was done.
It's interesting. I created this program, about 7-8 years ago. And I did it for a group of the 99s. Do you know what they are? That's the Women in Aviation group that was founded by Amelia Earhart in 1929. And it was called the 99s because she sent out an offer to the 99, to all the licensed female pilots, and 99 people responded. So that's how it got its name. A little bit of trivia. But anyway, Amelia Earhart, 99. What was I about to talk about?
You said 7 or 8 years ago.
7 or 8 years. So I was doing it for a group of the Northern New Jersey chapter of the 99s. And afterwards, somebody asked me, was I a pilot? And I said, no, I only play one on TV. And she said, have you ever flown in an airplane? I said, oh yes, Southwest all the time. She said, how about a little airplane? I said, no. And she said, would you like to? And I said, yes. So the long and the short of it was that she took me on a flight, and we flew from not Teaneck, but right along, the New Jersey coast, northern New Jersey coast. And then we flew we flew up the Hudson all the way to Sullivan County or Orange County. We saw the Statue of Liberty from the air. I mean, it was just such an incredibly perfect opportunity to really get a sense of feeling what Elinor must have felt like doing that flight. So that was very, very cool. But I've only done it once, and I promised my mom I wouldn't do it again. I didn't tell her until afterwards. But yeah, that was quite an experience. So yeah, they do pretty neat things. How about any of you ever flown in a small aircraft or?
Hi, this is Mary Ellen. Thank you again for the program. But like when you were mentioning Curtis, we were up at the Curtis Museum in by the Finger Lakes. And one of their big displays this time was all about the women of aviation. It was really cool to see, a lot of them reflected in your story.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'll have to make a special trip up there as soon as we're able to travel again. That's wonderful. I have not visited the Curtis Museum. It's on my to-do list, so now I have an even better reason to do it. Yep, there. I will probably get up there again because I want to get back to Seneca Falls for. I was supposed to do a talk there this past year, during the 19th Amendment commemoration, but I've been up there a couple times, and I do want to get back at some point. So I will plan to stop at Curtis along the way. Any others?
We have a little airport in our area called Sky Manor Airport.
Uh-huh.
And, there was someone who offered to take me and a friend up in the plane, and it was the air was like a little bit choppy, but they took us up anyway, and it was very exhilarating, and also kind of like I couldn't believe like how far we went. We were like seeing a body of water that I wasn't sure what we were looking at. It was very exciting, and I was also glad to get back down on the ground after.
I was not in the least bit scared, but when I told my mom, she was scared for me. So I guess I'm a little like these other people. It's my day comes, but it was thrilling. It was really thrilling. I'm so glad I got to do that.
Carol, was your experience in a biplane?
My experience was in a little, was a 1950s airplane, I think. It was technically, I think she said a 4-seater, but the back seat was a bench seat, so I didn't believe that. There was really our 2 seats, and that was it. And she actually, when we were at a level, at altitude, she let me hold the controls and just level for a minute. I'm sure I wasn't really doing anything, but I'm trying to remember now. This is 7 years. It was red. Isn't that awful? I'm an old librarian. People would say, I need this book. It's red. But I can't remember for sure what kind of plane it was, whether it was a biplane. I think it was.
Was it open?
It might be a Cub. No, it was not open.
Okay.
It was a closed cockpit. Yeah. It wasn't a Piper Cub. That's what Anne Baumgartner Carl flew, and that's a biplane. I don't know.
Interesting.
I don't think, I would have to look it up. I actually have a photograph of me by the airplane. So whoever asked me that, was that you, Dan, or who?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
If you want, I can send you a picture of the airplane.
I like that.
Okay, I'll make sure I do that when we get off today. It'll be good because I haven't looked at the photograph in half a dozen years, so it's always fun to go back and have tiptoes through history. It's actually interesting. I don't know about any of you guys. We've set it up so I have photographs that from our digital photographs that just go up on our TV screen when we leave it, and I haven't seen that photo go up there. Now I have tens of thousands of photos, but it is interesting how you see, even though it's supposed to be random, you see the same ones appear and you don't see the others. And I don't think I've seen that one pop up in all the years that we've had it. So, but it's interesting. Any other questions or comments? It was so much fun. Oh, I see you all finished your ice cream.
Well, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and I will be so excited to recommend this to others to watch.
Well, excellent. At my website, tellingherstories.com, you can see when I'm doing other programs. And I've got a half a dozen more, a little over that, left this Women's History Month. And then it slows down a bit, but I do 4 to 6 every month in regular, ordinary months, it seems. Yeah, non-Women's History Months, the other 11 months of the year. So definitely, please come back. I'm working on a program called Mothers of Invention, which I plan to premiere in the fall. Now that I was working on it in the pandemic earlier, and then of course, when I started getting busy with Women's History Month, I put it aside. But once I have some breathing room again, I'm going to go back to researching and writing and finding good photos and great stories, which is what I like. I love finding these wonderful offbeat stories to tell, the things we've never heard of before. So that's fun.
Thanks so much, Carol.
It is a real pleasure.
This was a very exciting topic, and